Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Deputy Yiddish Editor Zach Golden. Thanks for joining us here at the Forward. As you already have, please keep writing in where you are watching from, and if you'd like, also add in who your favorite cantor of all time is, if you have one. With me are cantor Judith Berkson and cantor David Childs. Thanks for joining me about what you guys are up to. This talk is called How Young Cantors Are Embracing the Sound of the Traditional Synagogue. And it's called that specifically because I was warned not to use khazones in the title, which is a fair warning because khazones means something specific and you have to draw it out from cantorial music, and both of you know the distinction between the two. You live the distinction between the two. And so, yeah, I want to first say hi to you and hi to everyone who's here, and give everyone a bit of biographical information about both of you. So we have Judith Berkson, cantor, composer, multi-instrumentalist, who's been active in Jewish music and synagogue leadership for over 15 years, is the cantor at Congregation Beth Shalom, Santa Clarita Valley here in California. I'm speaking from Los Angeles. We're all actually in California at the moment. She has worked with Theodore Bikel, who I grew up listening to, so this is a big deal for me. Frank London of the Klasmatics, has performed on NPR and PBS, has performed at the vaunted Krakow Jewish Music Festival, and also, I may add, has recently received a doctorate from CalArts. And she has written an opera about the Viennese cantor Salomon Sulzer and the composer Franz Schubert in 2010 to 2012. Her music has been written about in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, Time Out, Lilith, The Jewish Week, and Tablet. And cantor David Childs here, originally from Santa Barbara, California, is a cantor at Temple Beth Israel in Port Washington, New York, and has previously worked on the cantorial staff at Sinai Temple in Beverly Hills, at Shomrei Torah in West Hills, and has also been part of the studying of khazones under cantor Jack Mendelson and cantor Richard Nadel, and has studied Yiddish art music with Yehudi Weiner, the son of Lazer Weiner, and has been involved with a wide variety of cantorial and Yiddish pursuits. So, and I happen to know both of you through different means. David, I have to shout out the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies, which we both attended at a point, and where we met. Yeah, so let's just get right into it. What is the difference between cantorial music and khazones? When we're talking about khazones, and what is it? Where do we hear it? Why is it not what I'm used to hearing theoretically, if you don't know the difference? David, why don't you get a crack at it?
The difference between cantorial music and khazones.
Or just like, what's the
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I mean you can hear it in the name. Like you have like a strong connotation with khazones. It's like cantor. I've never thought about there being a differentiation, but I think you're right. Cantorial music is a broader term for music used by cantors, and it evokes synagogue music, and it can be argued and broadened easily. But khazones, you can't say khazones is like something different than khazones. It's like it's the old world Ashkenazi style that has strong connections with both the Yiddish language and European art music, and but it's also its own genre in itself. So that's the difference I see. It's more specific.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, when we talked a bit before, we mentioned that khazones and cantorial music, I think maybe in the modern day has sort of flown off in its own musical directions, but khazones was very much tied to Nonesuch. And Nonesuch was is the constant sound of the synagogue based on the time and place that you're at. Nowadays, it's not necessarily true that you'll hear music that is always flowing according to the modes and modalities of Nonesuch, but in those days it was. Maybe Judith, you could explain how khazones evolved from Nonesuch and what do we understand what I'm trying to say about Nonesuch? Yeah.
Yeah, well, Nonesuch is a term that kind of, in this circumstance, it refers to the scales and modes that are used, that are sung, and to use, to take the liturgy and chant the liturgy. And each mode is kind of, there's a different mode for shacharis, for, for different times of the day, different times of the year, different holidays. And each mode has, it's not only scales and modes, but it's also these like motives, these little pieces of melody that are woven into the improvisation. And that's another important thing about khazones, is that it's an improvised art. That's not to say that they're just making up music out of nowhere. I mean, it's rooted in these motives and these scales, but it's supposed to be not a written thing that you read. It's something that you're improvising by a deep meditative focus on the words, the prayers, the tefillah, and using the mode to highlight the words in real time, like it's improvisatory. So that in some ways, it really reflects where the cantor is at, where the chazan is at, like emotionally, and where the shul is at, getting a read of what's happening and all the emotions and what's going on. So the improvisatory part, I think, is really important too.
And so, so when I'm talking about the difference between modern cantor, what I mean by that is sometimes people compose things that are just their own pieces of music that people can sing along to, that are unique to the singer, to the cantor. But now we're talking about a system that, just to put it all together, comes from Europe, comes from these cantors learning both Western music, but also picking up their own traditions, improvising, but within this highly stylized and not formalized, but like set music and modality that reflects prayer. And then you would have these, and then they would be incredible singers, incredible composers. And this whole unit of things was called khazones, which has its own package to it because it's its own art form. And it was a huge deal, I would say, before the 1960s, before the 1950s, and it kind of faded out over time. And one of the just one other aside that I've noticed is you have to be really exposed to this kind of music to either appreciate it or sing it, because it's not only just strange to the modern ear to a certain extent, but it's also highly complex. I mean, what I tend to call it is the jewel, the crown jewel of Yiddishkeit, because of its depth, its emotionality, its complexity. And so we don't really hear it all too much anymore. But for me personally, it's very important to bring out this topic and explain it and demonstrate it and all these sorts of things, because the first person I learned Yiddish from was a chazan from the old world. He was a Holocaust survivor named Cantor David Kane. And he taught me, I went to his house once a week and he taught me Yiddish, and he made me speak Yiddish, and he made me sing Yiddish in a way. And his music became my music. And I knew that because he wanted me to essentially sing Yiddish, there was something within khazones itself, the way he sung the actual music that there was a connection that I want to bring out. There's an emotionality, there's a rawness to Yiddish as spoken in the culture that is expressed in this music.
It can't be separated.
No, he did not allow that to be separated, because as far as he was concerned, anything without that was German. And I mean, he knew German, but I mean, a linguist wouldn't agree, but from his perspective, that's what it was. So I want to get into, just for those who don't know, how big was khazones? Like, when we're talking about Yosele Rosenblatt walking into, I don't know, Madison Square Garden or the shul or any given shul, like what are we talking about in terms of levels of stardom? David, go ahead.
I wish I could be in Borough Park in the 30s, 40s. Like I wish I could be there and experience what Shabbos was like walking around. I hear anecdotes from my teachers. Cantor Jack Mendelson likes to talk about how he grew up in Borough Park, and they would go to hear a Kusevitsky, you'd go shul hopping to hear different cantors, and I think I also am very curious to know what it was like before the recording boom, because when it became possible to record music, what I understand is there was a huge explosion of popularity of khazones among Jewish communities. It became the soundtrack of life. And you mentioned Yosele Rosenblatt, Zach. I think when we were talking the other day, jazz singer came up. He was like, khazones was in Hollywood, like, and it was being broadcast to the world. So you can't get much bigger than that, I don't think.
And Judith, what would be your read on what the level of stardom I'm trying to get across?
Yeah, totally. Like what David just said. I mean, imagine the first talkie has like a cantor in it. It's pretty monumental. Yeah, they were superstars, and just to kind of go back a little bit to what you were saying. I mean, khazones itself is not really this monolith that was not changing through time. Like, I mean, every era of music was affecting it. Even Yosele Rosenblatt like made a lot of innovations to khazones. He had these congregational melodies and got people singing, which wasn't really done before, like to that degree. So there was an understanding that things were changing. Sulzer had the music of his time affecting, for better or worse, or however you want to look at it. But music outside was always influencing khazones. So it was a changing, evolving thing going on. But
yeah. No, I mean, like, one of the interesting things that I learned while, originally writing an article about Jeremiah Lockwood's album recording modern Hasidim, doing khazones, was I actually read some of Sholem Aleicham's Yosele Solovey and learned about how the chazanim in the old world would gather mishorim, gather little, younger kids to become their choir, and they would train them. And then there was these systems that ended up being brought over to the new world of these choirs, backing up the chazan. I was in a synagogue choir once, so I know that tradition to a certain extent kept going. But there, even with the musical changes over time, even maybe just how it just got structured, the level of prestige dropped at a certain point. And the styles of it and the knowledge of it, the very specific knowledge of the very specific techniques kind of changed over time. It's hard to put really your finger on it. I would say that in the 60s, with this need for congregational singing, like with like Shlomo Carlebach and the other famous person is escaping my memory right now.
well, yeah,
Sorry.
it seems like it was a bunch of maybe reasons, like maybe the popularity. Another thing that could speak to that is like these newly immigrated communities, you know, at the turn of the 20th century. So, you know, and this feeling for home and everything like that, you know, identifying their roots, but then certainly after the Holocaust and then and like and these kind of the more assimilation kind of epic you know, period, but maybe also like I mean, then there's also there were schools before, but then the schools sort of made this codification of what had been an oral tradition, and I think that's where things got a little bit different, where instead of learning it, you know, you'd be a Mishora and then you'd learn. You're going to school and learning in a completely different kind of system, and I think that sort of affected somehow the transmission of the practice.
Yeah, I would say that the education system and just it coincided with the decline of Yiddish as spoken by the Jewish masses. I mean, the mass assimilation hit on all sections, and including I would say there was an Americanization in the even the Haredi world, which is why this music in that world was put to the side. This was a uniform thing where this connection to Europe and this constant flow of cantors, you know, training in Europe, coming to America, as much as the fact that educators and rabbis who came from Europe and then went to America and educated people and kept people in touch with their traditions, when that pipeline was cut off and this pipeline was cut off, then things changed. There was no connection to Poland and Ukraine and all of these places. But you know, I wonder if there were attitudinal shifts. You know, I don't think people were incapable of listening to this music and enjoying it. What do you think, Dan?
I want to give a hot take. I think microphones also played a really significant role. I can't back this up with any citations, but I'd love to do a research project on this. Microphones led to lessening necessity for a vocal technique that allows a voice to carry, which khazones, you know, it merged with that. And the need for that vocal technique, it worked perfectly for shuls. And as that, you know, kind of like started to fall away, I think the quality may have started to decline. And
because it's so specifically based on a sonic environment
yes
of a large room. You know, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because people do get annoyed at my khazones when it's anywhere smaller, my personal khazones, and when it's in any room smaller than, let's say, a mid-sized gymnasium or something. But I'll never forget when I went to the oldest theater, just to the backstage, the door was open, of the oldest theater on Broadway here in Los Angeles, and which was built for pre-microphone, and I decided to just get up on stage and try to sing something myself, and that was totally different, a totally different experience. Yeah. And of course, khazones was performed in theaters like this, and you know, great cantors who were outside of the normal fold of who could be davening at shul, like the chazantes, the female cantors, and you know, a number of others that are being studied lately. You know, I think there's something to the purpose-built space that makes khazones work. Maybe there is something to it.
And I think it's a broader thing in music in general, but khazones isn't immune to that. Also, I don't know if you've ever been to Anshe Chesed in Manhattan, big shul. I met one of my mentors, Canon Natasha Hirschhorn, there, and she said, "David, come in here, like stand on the bima." And I was like, "Cool, this is awesome." She's like, "Now sing something," and it was like, whoosh, like the sound, my voice just dispersed throughout the entire room.
Wow.
That's how things were built. Yeah.
So I want to then follow up. Okay, so we've seen the history. We've seen kind of an understanding of what we're talking about. Although we're going to get into actual examples of this for those who haven't really heard it or seen it. And now there are just fewer and fewer pulpits or places that are interested in hearing this kind of music. But nonetheless, both of you, along with many others, but I know that, David, you've been studying with these masters. Judith, you've been also composing your own khazones, which is incredible, that I've had the pleasure of hearing. What brought you to wanting to do this? Judith, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, well, my dad is a chazan, and yeah, just grew up in that environment in shul, same with my father. My family had a group that performed Jewish music and khazones, and well, I wasn't really singing khazones then, but I was, backing my dad up when he would do it, and just being completely exposed to it in that way, and also being dragged to every khazones concert that was happening. I grew up in Chicago. My dad was also good friends with Barry Sirota, Oliver Shalom, who was an amazing man who produced all of these records, hundreds of records of khazones. It's all archived. You can find it online. I think it's accessible. And so he was really good friends with my dad. And so just a lot of concerts and chazonim that would come in. I would, it's just constantly around it. But that being said, it was not necessarily inevitable, but maybe, I don't know, I feel like, and my dad also has a real strong connection to the old world khazones. Of course, like with modern, adjustments and things, but he was very much into these old bootleg recordings of chazonim and records, and he would study through listening to these bootlegs. And so, I would watch him what's he doing down there? He'd be studying. And so to me, it wasn't chazonis and it's funny you mentioned chazonis and cantorial music. And I mean, I totally understand. Yeah, there's a difference, but to me, it's just what it is. It's just what it is. And when I daven, when I lead, of course I'm cognizant of this modern moment, and I put that into it, and I have new pieces too, but essentially it's just not what it is unless it's what it is. And to me, it's just what it is. When you daven, it's chazonis, and it's not even, it was just I thought I just thought it was normal. Like I became a cantor, and I thought what the old world was normal, because that's what I grew up in. When I started to see, oh wait a minute, in the past 20 years, oh wait a minute, things are very different, So, yeah, that's.
No, I understand that, because I can tell you that when I found out that, the cantor I learned Yiddish with, and his sort of music wasn't the norm, I was, as usual, like a little taken aback. David, what's your story to where we are now?
Well, you see, Zach, my father is a cantor. No, I love that, Judith. I love that. It's we get to share that.
No, but that's yichus. We gotta establish that yichus. It's not a coincidence.
I used to try to put that somewhere else in the autobiography, but no, yeah, my dad was and still is a huge influence on my musical identity, and I did not always desire to be a cantor in a synagogue. I grew up studying a lot of music, piano, played saxophone and band, kind of had all these different projects going on. I could never focus on one thing. And but still, while all this was going on, my mom is like, come on, David, we gotta make your dad's kol nidre. That has been the background of my life. I started dabbling in singing khazones in college, in my junior recital. I had my Italian, French, German stuff. I'm singing "Du meine Seele, du mein Herz." I have my Schumann, and then, but I always managed in my programs to sneak in "V'lirushalayim Yircha," and like my dad, would coach me on it on chazones, and he taught me how to krecht. And I remember my teachers saying, like, like, David, the Yiddish stuff and the cantorial stuff is great. It's not Italian, French, or German though, but it's great that you do it. You got to focus. And I'm like, oh, I have to focus. I really have to focus. So now I'm glad I get to focus on this stuff.
And do you get a chance? You've been getting some chances over time to perform it as well, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I had a concert yesterday in Santa Barbara with my home shul CBB, and I did a couple. It was a short program, but
no. And so now, I asked you, when we were preparing for this, I was asking you about your musical inspiration. So, before we get into you sort of explaining your connections and your inspirations, I'll just have some selected clips of Chazonim you find inspirational, play, and then we'll sort of dissect and sort of identify them all. So go ahead and let's roll some footage or tape. Soon.
I think we're having. I'm not getting sound. Zach, you're on mute right now.
Yeah, right. Well, in that case, I think just I will find out later as it works. In the meantime, let's just talk about who they are, who you put down when we were talking about it. Judith, if you want to go ahead and let's talk Perla Feig, and I think you put someone else down.
Okay. So I chose Perla Feig, who is one of a handful of women cantors who were kind of colloquially called khazones, like sort of a play on the Rebbitzin, like sort of like the wife of the cantor. So I don't know if that's derogatory or not, but anyway, it became the name of this group of women, and yeah, it was a smallish group, but these women, including like Sophie Kurtzer and Freda Loescher and Perla Feig, they actually managed to get in the studio and record from as early as the 1920s, and so we have these recordings of actual female cantors. And yeah, so Perlefag is one of them. And the sound is very unique. So I wanted to share. Hopefully, we can share some of that because it's sort of an inspiration to the kind of resonance and the kind of voice that I'm using a lot with khazones.
Right. And if I'm not mistaken, you also put down Yechiel Alter Carniel.
Right. So Yechiel Carniel is one. I think he's the oldest cantor that was recorded. He was born in mid 19th century. His recordings are from the 20s, but he was quite old at that time already, and he had a very interesting way of chanting. He was sort of a zoger, like a really a very highly skilled improviser, and I just thought that his patterns and his way of davening was very unique. I really haven't heard something quite like it.
You know, we have a comment in the chat or question in the chat box that I want to bring up. What year were the women performing? Just, I feel like people might be surprised about this.
Well, like Sophie Kurtzer recorded like 78s in the 1920s, and there are all these artifacts from Yiddish newspapers, and you can see that there would be a concert. Sometimes they say the chazan, the Romanian chazan, the Polish chazan, depending where they were from, and they would have these concerts, and they were wildly popular, just like the men were in some instances, and selling out concert halls, and so the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s was that kind of period. Maybe kind of after that, it sort of disappeared in a way. I mean, I don't want to say disappeared because I don't know, but yeah.
And David, you put down a few people. First of all, your father, and then people who I think taught your father. If I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah. I'm trying to remember what I wrote down. But I know who you're.
Jackie Mendelson, Moshe Ganshoff.
Yeah. So my mentor in my study at JTS, and is still my mentor is Cantor Jackie Mendelson, who I mentioned earlier. He was also one of my father's mentors at HUC. And another inspiration for me is Jackie's teacher, Moshe Ganshoff, who he has lots of recordings online. Some good, Judith mentioned bootleg recordings too. You could find if you look for it. I love bootleg recordings. They're the best. So yeah, Moshe Ganshoff, I did a lot of study of his music with Cantor Mendelson during my time at JTS. I think the first time I heard recording and was like, whoa. It was Gershon Sirota. And that voice, just this big, dramatic voice. And I remember, Zach, when you and I were at Ziegler the same time, I was spending time in a room not working on rabbinics, but transcribing Sirota recordings, because that's when I really got hooked. I was like, oh, I need to get more into this study.
Gershon Sirota just is a powerhouse, and when I was preparing the recording I wanted to play, I found one I couldn't believe. So hopefully that will come out. But Judith, you mentioned the next topic I want to get to, which is the special techniques of khazones. You mentioned a zoger, and what's really neat about khazones is that you can tell that it was originally learned and taught in Yiddish. And why? Because all the special terminology that makes specifically khazones make sense is in Yiddish. You have klechs, you have Bikel, you have the steigels. And I want to go through them so people understand what they are, and let's see if we can demonstrate them. So first of all, klechs is like scratching, but it's so this is like the most dramatic difference between modern or just Western opera and khazones is the fact that you need to cry. You need to cry in your music, and there's a vocal technique that can get you to do that. I don't know. I'm just gonna throw the ball up at this point. If anyone wants to describe cracks, try to do that. Judith, maybe I don't know if you're feeling it right now. I don't. We'll
I'm happy to do it.
I'm feeling a little cracky.
I can do whatever you want me to do.
Okay. Whoever's feeling cracksy, all right, David, you're feeling cracksy. Give us some cracks.
This is a familiar one. Rochem, no. You know, no. You know, there's like it's like a little little break.
Yeah, you got the break. Judith, maybe did you have something in mind? Crack size?
Yeah, well, you know, it comes to mind like something like from like Carnegie Hall. Sim, Shalom, Taiva, Uiviracha. Like that, like with the.
Wow. Yeah, and thank you. I mean, this is like this is the building block that, you know, and one of the things I really enjoyed talking about when we were talking about this before is that this stuff is intimidating to the listener. And it's intimidating not because it's the music, but because it's the emotions. And Krebs is a powerful emotion to get to be on the other end of.
I know that even, you know, as a kid, my dad was always trying to get me to do Krebs all the time. And I couldn't do it because I didn't want to do it. It was too emotional. Like I couldn't, it was too raw, you know? And it was only when I got to be an adult that I could do it, you know?
You know, humility has a very central, ironically, you know, for all the Sturm and Drang about the cantors being big deals and egoistic and the rest of it. Jewish prayer, like khazones Baker, is like very about humility, and a very intense kind of humility.
You're both you're embodying a humility and supplication, but you're also this virtuosic vessel, because it's like you're the interlocutor, I think, between Hashem and the people. And so it's like you have to break through, and you have to almost like cry to break through. And then the virtuosity, I always feel like the virtuosity and kind of the way that it's like mysterious and also extremely complicated. What is this person doing? How are they doing that? It's necessary for the music, because it's almost like you become, it's like for this elevated state, you go into this kind of superhuman, it's supposed to be confusing and mysterious. That's like how you get to a spiritual state. I think the cantor gets to a spiritual state.
Although it reminds me of the old joke about man in front of the bima in front of the Torres, and he's just being really crying and crying his heart out, and the rabbi and the cantor are like, who's this guy who's more humble than me? I don't remember the joke, mate. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I've heard the joke.
It was totally lined up in my head, completely slipped out of me. Another technique that I was interested is dreidels. So dreidels are like dreidel is a spinner. You know, dreidel is some sort of spinning process that is also, if you listen closely, has a unique sound. Judith, do you have anything in mind that could be demonstrative of dreidel in
Sure. There's some modes, that steigers, that kind of like lend themselves more to it. But let me see. Boy, 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 ya, ya, ya. Something like that.
That
Like,
would do it. I think, yeah, it's it is. So, you know, and this is where we're going to want to make the distinction between a recitative that like goes in a lot of different places and the dreidluch that just winds you into this like I don't know, almost like a circle of your existence, you know, Sufi-esque almost. Um you know, and then another concept is zogech, or to be a zoger, you know, and that was a concept I didn't completely understand. I thought I did. It's like getting really into the prayer, but you know, you were defining it in a certain way of like improvisation in a certain sense. Judith, yeah.
That's what I've come to understand it to be. Like, when somebody's called a real zoger, means like they have a real intimate connection with the nusach. They're able to wind it in a very special way, maybe in a unique way, maybe in a, you know, just, and they're able to maneuver through the modes in a very intricate and special way. That's I think the improvisation, it has to kind of do with that. That's my understanding.
So David, do you have anything that's zogechs in nature ready to go?
Oh, yeah. It's hard because I feel like I haven't captured exactly like what is zogech. Tomachti esedosai bishlosh esrei seivos uvesha'arei demos kilo nishlavos.
Thank you.
It's saying, it's like every word.
There's no separation between the music and the words in the sense of like its intentionality. Like
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
I and that's why these concepts remain in Yiddish, because it's like, you know, it's quite a lot. Another concept is the Bikel, which we have is the Yiddish word for the falsetto. But you know what was funny was when we were talking about this, a falsetto is not enough to really call it a Bikel. It's all also contextual in a certain way. It comes to punch in an emotional way at a certain point in the music. And maybe since I'm told we might be able to get back to video mode, do we think we can play the Bikel video or the segment of it? So, you know, there's that. And then before, you know, as that video is loading, I also want to talk about the last bit, which I won't ask any demonstration, but oh, actually, let's just go do this. Perfect. Yes, that Yosele Rosenblatt gets to demonstrate by Cole because, you know, but you know, it's just what it is.
Yeah. No one like him. No one like him. Yeah.
And there are other terminologies that, you know, I still have yet to fully research, but actually the most fundamental one here are the steigers, which, you know, again, in a way, I thought I had an understanding of it, but like, there's always a little knaich to make it to bereichen the concept, to, you know. So So a Steiger is a mode not that far away from the Makan system in the Islam, Arabic North African system, in which it's a scale, except you go down with different notes than you go up. But it's crucially different because, as actually Judith, explain to me why it's different. I know you have before, with the motifs in addition to it.
Oh yeah, I mean, like every kind of theory that's like put on a music happens later, So Steiger's, I mean, it was sort of sure it's part of it, but it's more like the motive. So like for instance, the mode Magen Avos, which is a minor kind of mode, and the name comes from Erev Shabbos when that mode actually comes in, so they give it that name. But it's used Shabbos morning, that scale, as a Steiger, but what distinguishes it is the motif. So we're all familiar with, if we go to shul, shachis, you say like Nishmat kol chai tivorech et shimcho Adonai Eloheinu Hashem Elokeinu. So that is the same scale Steiger, but it's used in a different way. So it's all about the motive, and then the chazan is going to take that motive and run with it. I mean, I have an example if you want to hear. I recently did a whole kind of deep dive into some Jacob Kusevitsky, some davening. Okay, wait, maybe I lost it. Oh boy. Oh shoot. Maybe I don't have it. Okay, but hang on a second. Maybe David wants to talk while I try to find this.
I mean, I got another example of the difference in. Here, I'll give a basic example, and then Judith will find her.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So yeah, the motivic material is kind of what makes the difference. When they say motivic material, motifs, musical motifs, it's like a characteristic piece of music that comes back and comes back and comes back. And so we have modes, we have scales that are like there are church modes, Phrygian, Aeolian, etc., etc. We have our shul modes, which Judith was touching on: Hashem Malach, Ahava Rabbah, Magen Avot, Avos, and those are scales. But then what makes it usable as Steigers is like how we have our weekday Nonesuch. That's a minor scale. We can also use minor scale for Erev Shabbat. And that's where it gets into. It's not exactly motivic. Then we have other ones that, like Ukrainian Dorian has a different tonic. From Ahava Rabbah, Ahava Rabbah, da 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 da. Ukrainian Dorian goes da 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 da. It starts somewhere else, but it's
important that there's that the ending and beginning you can kind of hear. Okay, it's not just that it's going down a different way. It's also it's also having a gain.
Oh, another Steiger too, Lernen-Steiger.
Oh, wow.
That's Lernen-Steiger for learning, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't
know.
It's
the Talmud melody.
Yeah. So Judith, did you dredge it up?
Yeah. So I'm going to play a little piano with it too, just to kind of highlight the structure of where it's moving. So this is like, this is an example. So a Baal Tefillah might chant this, or really a chazan, anybody might just chant in the one mode. But if they're really skilled, chazan will be able to kind of navigate different modes for the text. So everything that this is about, why they're doing that is based on the text. So This is from Shachri's Shekain Chovas. So this is a little bit in a higher register, but Shekain Chovas, Kol Yitzurim Lefanecho. So then you see there's a little modulation. Did you hear that? So you started here, da dee da 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 dee da 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 da, the minor mode, but then it goes to this major on the 4th degree. This major one. So Lefanecho Adonai Eloheinu Velohei Avoseinu. So instead of going back down to the minor, Kusevitz goes to the Ahava Rabbah. A little play on that. And then it's going to go again to that major. Lehodos, to praise into this key. Lehodos, leholer, lishabeach, lefoer. So to praise, to exalt, to, all of this stuff is in this mode. Leromer, lehader. And then he goes into this key to crown, to even more praise, and he goes into up into a higher key, into Ahava Rabbah on the 5th degree. Okay, so I'll go from there. It's coming back somewhere. Le'ale, to raise, u'le'kales, al kol shiri David ben Yishai, Abdecha Meshilchecha. So back home, where we started, but through all these cycles of modulation. And I personally find this super interesting.
No, I mean, well, because the modulation is very specifically tied to the words and their meanings, and you're getting like all these it's in other words, instead of the nusach being just like a fluid blanket that's gradually changes, you find that that's actually being weaved with like different ideas as you go on, and it creates this this massively complex system emotionally and musically that match up with each other. So we have somehow time has flown. We have 5 minutes, I believe. I don't know how this exactly works, since it's been my first time hosting one of these, so I'm very grateful for the forward to have this opportunity, and for you guys for coming on. I want to see if it's possible to maybe answer some questions that have come up, and then if possible, I don't know, depending on time, maybe we could get back to the music or whatever we're allowed to have time for. I don't know, but let's get to a question. Let's see. There's a cross. Rena Fisher writes, can you speak to the cross fertilization between klezmer and khazones? Which is the chicken and which is the egg? Which is something I never thought about, but maybe there's something between these two. Judith, do you have a thought on this?
I've often had the same question. I think perhaps the roots, klezmer has roots in khazones, or certainly the language of klezmer. If you listen, you hear davening in that. I mean, it's just so obvious in a lot of the improvisation. But yeah, kind of developing simultaneously, one fitting the other. I would say that's my sort of take on it.
I have another question here, which gets to my point about which I wanted to get to about our aspirations for this. How often do you do, as Steven Stern writes, how often do you real chazanis in shul? Which occasions? Which part of the service? David, is that a question?
Yeah, no, and it's my answer is as often as possible. But there's these rules of thumbs that come up of like, oh, you can only do one big piece of service and stuff. I don't know if by that. We'll see. I want to give a shout out to Temple Beth Israel in Port Washington, where I'm starting next week. Let's see what they tolerate. If
I think a
anyone,
number of them are here, so they're going to be
that's
tolerated a
great.
lot.
That's great. Let's see. I love to not create a distinction and to move between. And you know, if I get the chance to do a repetition of an Amida, you know, it just kind of it pops in sometimes. It might be for a full text. Maybe I do a chazanisha Birkat Kohanim, or maybe I just use a little bit of connecting material in between. Like I'm trying to think of yeah, going from one song to another, and there's some text, and I'll use a little chazanas. Yeah,
That's good. And Judith, same question to you.
I would say similar to what David said. Yeah, you know, weaving it. I don't want to make a distinction, but you know, but kind of going into congregational melodies and more chazanas. But basically, to me, if the you know, the shul, my lovely wonderful shul in Santa Clarita, we daven, you know, and shachris, and I just do it with nusach, and I do it, and you know, and sometimes I'm in a real improvisatory mood. I might like go on a little bit, and but not, you know, I just I can't seem to not do it. It has to be present for it's just not for me, but for everyone, you know, to kind of this is the way
You
it
know,
is. But yeah.
and I'm hoping, you know, well, the more, the better, the more it gets into more people's ears, the better it can get for in my opinion, the full restoration, or as much of a restoration of Yiddishkeit as we can possibly muster. Because, you know, it's not just about the music, as I want to emphasize, it's also just about the culture and the religion. It's fundamental to being able to express that the spirit that I want to express in myself. I've heard both of you express in your music here, actually, as well as in performances I've heard of you. And to me, that's like the geist, that's the spirit of Yiddishkeit in you know, allowed to be expressed. I want to just before we go, Bernard Quebec in the webinar chat reminded me what the punchline to the joke was that I was trying to get to, which is, look who thinks he's nothing. You know, the guy at the bima who's more humble than the rabbi and the cantor. He's look who thinks he's nothing, which is I think a great way to end on. Wow. So thank you all. And in the follow-up recording email, I'm sure that the music we intended to play will also be part of that. It's worth listening to, and thank you.